GrowCFO is where finance leaders grow together. Join thousands of like-minded professionals using GrowCFO to access the combined knowledge and experience of the finance leader community. You can join us today at growcfo.net. Hello and welcome to the GrowCFO show. I'm your host, Kevin Appleby, and today I'm joined by a new member of our mentoring team, Peter McKenzie. Hello, Peter.
Hello. Very pleased to be here, Kevin.
Peter, you're sitting not in the UK, but in Spain. Tell us about how you ended up in Spain.
Okay, well, that's a long story. When I left university, I started work for what was then Coopers & Lybrand in London. And my initial introduction to the accounting and finance world was to work for 3 years in a place called Plumtree Court, which was actually very near Holborn, for Coopers. And I was an auditor, and that was where after my 3 years, I successfully passed the exams and became a chartered accountant. So very pleased with that. But I have to admit that auditing was not really my thing. It didn't really spark my ambition to stay in practice. Although I loved finance because I actually did an accounting degree as well at university. Took a 1.5 year sabbatical. And what I decided was, back then, being like a very typical English person, I think, I didn't have any language skills. I decided to take a sabbatical and learn a language. And I didn't really know which one to choose, but I was given the opportunity to come to Spain and to be an English teacher. So I spent a 1.5 years in Valencia, which is on the east coast of Spain, about halfway down, as an English teacher, teaching English as a foreign language to people in Valencia. And that is where I learned Spanish. And it's also where I met a girlfriend who later converted into my wife.
No, you're stuck in Spain at this point.
That's why I'm in Spain. I didn't stay all that time from way back then because that was a long time ago. I went back to the UK, into banking, and then we ended up coming back to Spain after that. But that's my link. That's why I'm down here, because in the end, I learned Spanish. And when I went back into finance and went back into sort of working in industry, so to speak, I really wanted to use my language skills. So I ended up coming back to Spain and working here for over 20 years.
Does that mean that you're just as happy mentoring somebody who's a Spanish speaker as somebody who's an English speaker?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I've spent so long in Spain now that I speak and I use my Spanish daily. In fact, my role here, it's 99% in Spanish, because I do use English. Because ultimately our private equity owners are based in London. But most of my work is done in Spanish, and that's been the case for years. So I'm fluent in Spanish, I think in Spanish, I speak in Spanish all the time. So yes, for me, having mentees in Spanish is no problem at all. For me, it's exactly the same English-Spanish. I hope it's the same for them.
Tell me a little bit more about your background. You became a teacher, but clearly you moved back into the finance world, and you talked about being in financial institutions. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when I went back, although it was good fun being an English teacher, it didn't really, I couldn't see a future in it, let's put it that way. So I headed back to the UK, and it was 1994, which was quite a good time. The markets were pretty good back then. There was a lot of people looking for finance, certainly newly qualified accountants. There was a good market. So I went back to London, which is my hometown, and I got a job with Citi, so Citi Group, who at the time were based in the Strand in London. I started my career there. I started with Citi on the sort of trading capital market side. I was what they call a business financial controller. So I was sort of semi as an accounting professional, but semi sort of trader support. So running risk books and looking at very interesting things like FX options and derivatives and all those sort of things that the banks were using back then to trade. And after that, I was then taken within Citi into a role where it was far more sort of accounting based. We were doing the books of various European vehicles that Citi had, consolidating books, and very, very much sort of like a head office position within a multinational firm as an accountant, and that's when I began to manage teams. And I worked with Citi for 20 years, and I moved back to Spain with Citi. I ended up being in Portugal for a while with them. I ended up touching nearly all of the businesses that Citi were running. So from the corporate investment banking through to retail, through to cards. I spent 20 years with Citi, and I touched a lot of different pieces of the show, so to speak.
If you're working as a CFO or a aspiring CFO in the financial sector, Peter's your man.
Yes. I mean, I'd like to think so, because I mean, I as I say, I worked up. So I worked up from being just an individual contributor all the way through to being a team leader, to eventually being a CFO. So I was a CFO for 3 or 4 businesses within Citi. I was also a CFO in an operations unit, very large operations center that they had based down in Spain as well. Financial institutions, banking, all of the stuff that comes with that side of the industry. I mean, I know it back to front, and some of the things that come along with that is some quite technical pieces of challenges that come with being in a bank. And I'm sure anyone listening will know about things like balance sheets, rules, and capital adequacy requirements, all those type of things. So I've been through all of that, and I know that today it's still very much the same sort of challenges people face as back then when I was doing it as a CFO.
So working in that kind of background, you must have had experience of mergers, acquisitions, and all those types of good things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I've been through more mergers than I can count. I mean, even I know our background is also with Coopers. So I started when I was with Coopers. Funnily enough, we had our first sort of merger right back then, because in the UK, Coopers and Lybrand actually merged with Deloitte, if you remember that, before even the PwC came together.
Before I joined Coopers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before you joined.
I remember I joined Coopers, and I think I'd just done the final interview, and literally the day after my offer letter dropped through the door, another letter dropped through the door that said, "Oh, by the way, we're merging with PW."
Right. Yeah, no. I mean, obviously the Coopers and PW, and they started my life, my corporate life. I already started merging. But within Citi, when I joined Citi, that was the time when there was a guy on top of Citi called Sandy Weil, who basically was an acquisitions monster. He went after everything that moved in the market. So we, as a group, they merged with a thing called Travelers Group. Citi absorbed Schroders, which was a broker business that was in the UK that I'm sure a lot of people know. Salomon Smith Barney was another part that came into the investment bank. So all the way through that whole process within Citi, I was involved in merging teams, not necessarily the corporate structuring, but in terms of actually merging teams, pulling teams together, pulling procedures together, constant change all the way through. From a professional standpoint, I've also been involved, especially when I was in the corporate investment bank, in the actual transactions that we did as a bank. So I was involved in those as well from a transactional standpoint. And I actually was a lead from an individual basis on a transaction where a startup tech company was sold to a very large Japanese company. I mean, I've been involved in transactions, and I've also sat within corporations that have been involved in mergers and acquisitions.
That's two very, very different things. And I've never really been involved in the transactions, although I've been the finance lead in businesses that have been sold back in my days in the chemical industry. Because I was so close to the business, I wasn't allowed to be involved in the transaction. But the post-merger integration piece, I find as a fascinating one, because I've seen it done very well, and I've also seen it done extremely badly. And there's a huge amount to learn in that process.
There is. And I mean, I'm like you, I've seen it done very well. I've seen it done very badly. And I mean, there's always a difference in cultures, no matter what type of institution you work for, no matter what, if you're thinking it's two banks that are merging or two accountancy firms, you think, okay, they're going to be the same, a big four. If you imagine that EY were to merge tomorrow with KPMG, which is, obviously not possible, but if it were, you'd say, well, they're two big four accountancy firms that would be the same type of culture, but it's, they're completely different. And within the banking world, it was very different to be within Citi, and then to see the investment bankers coming from Salomon Smith Barney, they had a completely different attitude. It comes down a lot to the individual managers of the units as well. That's also true. How well you merge, how well you treat the people that are coming on board. There's always winners and losers in these things as well. That's also clear, because most of these companies try and make it a merge. They try and make out that it's equal for everyone, but it never is. There's always a winner. There's always one of the two parties that tends to put more people in senior positions than the other. So it's an interesting challenge. It's been interesting being part of that. I think, as you say, I think sometimes it's done well, sometimes not so well.
Peter, I believe that as well as your day job, where you're a general manager, you're mentoring, but you're also speaking. Tell me a little bit more about what you do as a speaker.
Okay, so this is another long story, so I won't bore people with my story. But I used to, many years ago, when I was an up-and-coming CFO, I was never a big fan of speaking in public. I would always get by. I could present to small groups, 5, 6, 7 people. I had no problem doing the very basics. But it was never something I really enjoyed. When I took a role, which was with that large operations unit within Citi, where suddenly I was sort of jettisoned into a much bigger team. And from there, I was actually made the site head of the operation. So I was promoted into the operation. We had over 1,000 people. And my boss back then said, well, you're going to be expected, Peter, to give town halls to the team. And I was like, what does that mean? A town hall to the team? Does that mean the direct report team? What does that mean? He said, no, the 1,000 people. And I couldn't think of anything worse than having to stand in front of 1,000 people and try and give them an update on anything. I figured I had to learn how to speak in public. So back then I went through a training process. I began to actually learn how to do this. And I ended up finding that I actually love speaking. Once I got over that initial anxiety, it's an absolutely fantastic place to be. It's really effective in terms of being a good leader, because you can actually communicate to many people at once. The second thing, not many people enjoy public speaking. If you move into that space, you have a competitive advantage, because suddenly you're one of the people that's willing to stand up and speak, when most of your peers tend to sit back and say, I don't want to speak. So I ended up getting a real bug in terms of speaking, wanting to speak, speaking at conferences. And ever since then, I've done it because I've spoken at internal conferences where I've worked, but I even now speak at external industry conferences. So for example, I'm speaking next week in Cyprus, just to give you an example, at a CFO conference. Although I'm officially, at the moment, I'm not working as a CFO, but I'm so involved in the CFO space. And I just love it. I love going to these conferences. I love seeing what's going on in the industry. I love speaking from my perspective of finance, about being a CFO, about how to be a better CFO. So I do that as a little bit of a side gig, but it's something I really, really enjoy. And it's something that I always say to people that are moving up into the CFO space. It's a skill that you have to acquire. I mean, it's a must, because if you're a CFO and you don't have, at least not just acceptable, but good communication skills, good public speaking skills, I think, you're shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, because you've got to bring the team along with you. Chances are, as the CFO, you're involved right in the middle of change, right in the middle of business transformation. And that is only ever going to be successful by winning hearts and minds.
Absolutely. And not just that, you have to influence the rest of your organization. So there is that first point, which I completely agree with you, Kevin, that you need to be able to speak and lead your team, but you also need to influence the rest of your organization. And the best way to do that is to be visible and to be standing on stage or standing in the boardroom as a CFO that's able to articulate your message to everyone, because that's how you gain influence. So when you see people that don't want to do that and they're not being visible, you're really unable to influence quite as effectively the rest of the organization.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that we've got the virtual boardroom built into the GrowCFO, future CFO process, because teaching those skills to aspiring up-and-coming CFOs is so important.
I think the other thing with what you're saying there, the virtual boardroom, the other thing is to practice, right? One of the things you learn about public speaking is the only way you can improve is to practice. To have that environment where you can practice being in a boardroom environment, influencing the board, communicating to the board, I think, it's definitely a very good move.
Yeah. Your public speaking to CFOs, telling them how to get better. Do you have any sort of real pet subjects that you like talking about?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I like talking about the importance of courage, the importance of resilience and grit for being a CFO, because these recent years, especially, I mean, we're coming through a fairly difficult period, and the last couple of years coming out of the pandemic, particularly, these sort of topics have been quite popular. But I think CFOs have always had a tough task because there's a big ask of CFOs within any institution. I think we all know that, when times are good, the CFO can be the sort of the partner, but, sometimes it's been a position where it's sort of, taken for granted. But when things are more challenging, economic climates are more difficult, like we have at the moment, interest rates rising, inflation, people having to sort of reduce costs. Suddenly the CFO has to be involved in that. And sometimes those things are quite difficult to implement. They're not popular moves. They have to be sometimes seem to be quite insular, bring down the law and the rest of the companies where they work. There's a requirement to be resilient, to have that grit, to have that drive, to have courage to make decisions, and even the courage to make some mistakes as well. Because one of the other things I talk about is that a lot of finance people are perfectionists. When you get, we're trained, aren't we, to sort of reconcile things back to the zero difference and to be really meticulous. But when you move into the higher ranks of an organization, if you're going to be a business partner, sometimes you need to do things where there's a risk you don't get things 100% right because you don't have all of the information ever. Or if you're trying to get all of the information, you're not going to make decisions. Unlearning that perfectionism requires having the courage to sometimes make mistakes, as long as they're not deadly mistakes. You have to have that courage. So that's one of my pet areas that I talk about a lot.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more. And resilience, it's a word that's bandied around a lot. What really is resilience?
Well, resilience is being able to recover from setbacks. That's what I would say is the sort of definition of resilience. So when something doesn't go as expected, how quickly do you bounce back from that setback? How can you take the blows when things are difficult? How many blows can you take? How quickly do you put something behind you and get on with the job? How much does something affect you when something hasn't gone right? That's resilience. You need to be thick-skinned to be a CFO because sometimes you're going to come into conflict. That's the other thing. A lot of people avoid conflict. As part of the resilience or the courage piece is knowing how to face conflict, how to deal with conflict, how to deal with difficult conversations, which can be anything from the board we just mentioned through to your CEO, who may be someone you need to control, maybe a difficult person, through to your peers. There's always going to be, if you're doing your job right, I think there's always going to be moments of conflict. So having resilience means you're able to deal with situations that may not be optimal. You're not always laughing and having a great time. And sometimes it's difficult moments. And how quickly you can put those things behind you, get on with the next step. That to me is resilience.
Yeah. And I know from experience, that's a hard thing to acquire.
It is. It is hard.
Of taking things much too personally when they don't go right.
Yeah. And the way I always say, I can go through my sort of talk on resilience. The main thing is to practice. And this again sounds a bit silly, but you can practice. It's getting comfortable, feeling uncomfortable. That's how I always put it. So you can do that in non-important moments. You can give feedback to people. Some people don't like to give negative feedback to people, or feedback which is how to improve. But you can practice giving feedback how to improve to a difficult staff member, for example, doing that in a moment that's not critical. And you practice feeling uncomfortable, but it's not actually vital for you. Because the more you do that, or for example, pushing back on your boss, if you've got a CEO who's difficult, sometimes you need to practice pushing back. And you can do that when it's not necessarily the most critical conversation for you or for him or for her. But if you practice it, you're more able to do it when it really counts for you. So again, these things it's like not always feeling comfortable, not avoiding discomfort. You need to practice feeling uncomfortable to be able to actually be effective when it really counts.
The big message there is to grow, you've got to step out of your comfort zone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Here again, when you look at your comfort zone, you want to be stressed because stress is a good thing. Because to grow, we have to get stressed, but you have to measure how much out of your comfort zone you're able to go. So it's a balance between getting comfortable, feeling uncomfortable, but not feeling constantly uncomfortable. So it's almost like a game of playing, getting out of your comfort zone, going back in, recovering, going back out. This is the game. People tend to be on both sides, Kevin. Some people are constantly stressed and then you're facing burnout. Some people look to be constantly safe and then you're really getting into a very boring non-growth situation. So it's that sort of middle ground.
Peter, It sounds as though you have a really huge amount to give to up-and-coming CFOs. I have thoroughly enjoyed chatting. And one thing we haven't touched on is the fact that at the moment you're not doing a CFO role, are you? You're doing a general manager role.
That's right. Yeah. So I was the CFO. I was the CFO combined with a role that looked after technology for probably the last year and a half. But in December, I was offered the general manager role here. I still have a CEO on top of me because he looks after two companies actually within Spain, two quite large companies. But I'm the general manager. Yes, I'm not 100% focused on finance, but I have a very good lady that was my number 2 in my finance team, who's now the CFO here. And, I like to think that's also, although I spend my time mentoring and coaching CFOs, and I tend to talk in finance circles, I think maybe my story is not a bad one for people that are looking to try and expand their role. And one of the things I like to say to people, Kevin, is I think the CFO role is expanding anyway these days. So I think, my experience is I'm quite new in this role. I've been here for 5 months as a general manager, but I think it proves that CFOs, well, if I'm successful, which I hope I am, it proves CFOs can move out of the pure finance role. If while you're in that CFO role, you continue to explore other areas and add value to other areas within your firm.
I personally believe that some of the better CFOs have had experience outside of the finance function somewhere during their career journey. A small stint in marketing or general management never comes in wrong. It, at the very least, helps you understand the commercial realities of the business rather than just the numbers.
Yeah.
And it also helps you understand the challenges that other people outside of finance have on a day-to-day basis, and helps you when you're in a finance role empathize with them.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think that second point is really key, because we tend to talk our own sort of language within finance, and sometimes you don't understand that other people don't understand us quite as well. And the other thing is, as you mentioned marketing. I think also anything that's customer facing, where you get to see customers, their interaction with you, or the customer, the value your company or offering gives to a customer. I think that's also really key for the finance people to understand where the value is in the business. So I think also touching customers or touching a customer facing part of the business is a good thing to do.
Peter, brilliant. We have covered so much today. Definitely going to have you back as a guest again and talk about some of these subjects we've covered just briefly today in a lot more detail. I think we could probably record an entire podcast on resilience. We could probably record another one on mergers and acquisitions, and many other things that you write about and that you public speak about. Peter, thank you for being this week's guest on the GrowCFO show.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been a pleasure. Been good fun. Thank you.